asato ma sadgamaya tamaso ma jyotirgamaya mrityorma amritam gamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om, lead us from the transient to the eternal. Lead us from darkness to light. Lead us from death to immortality. Om, peace, peace, peace. Good morning, everyone, and happy Mother's Day. I appreciate your coming out on this special day, and my apologies. Last month when I was selecting the topic for today, I didn't put two and two together and didn't realize it would be Mother's Day. And so this is not a mother-related topic exactly, or at least not directly related, but I hope you'll still enjoy our time together. Let's enter a time machine together. Let's transport ourselves 500 years into the future. I think it's an interesting question to ask. What will historians 500 years from now be writing about our current age? What do I mean by the current age? Roughly 2000 to whatever, 2030 or 2050. There are different candidates for this, right? It's the age of the internet, the age of AI, the age of social media would be another candidate. And there's a case to be made for each of these. But I would suggest a different answer. It's related, but different. I would say that this is the age of instant gratification. Because it seems to me that instant gratification is the common denominator that all these things share, whether it's AI or internet, social media, and other things. But that our age, history will look back on us and say that this is the age of instant gratification. Why do I say that? Well, I gave a whole talk here a while ago, which some of you probably attended, called Of Mice and Marshmallows, where I discussed this in detail. So this will not be a repeat of that talk. But, very briefly, why do I call our current age an age of instant gratification? Because we're living in unprecedented times in a way, because we can get whatever we want, in whatever quantity we want. At our fingertips, and often for free, or what we think is free. We'll see that it does come at a cost, but at least monetarily in many cases, it seems to be free. Today I want to focus on social media, because I think that social media is one of the key dispensers of instant gratification. And it plays into and manifests a really striking paradox. This is what I would call the paradox of instant gratification. The more instant gratification we get, the more we populate our lives with different forms of instant gratification, the less happy we are, the more miserable we become, the more subject we are to mental health issues of all sorts, depression, anxiety, and so on and so forth. Why? This is the big question. And I think that Vedanta has really profound and deep answers to these questions, and that's what I'd like to explore today. There have been many studies done in the past few years showing that there are strong correlations between heavy social media use and mental health issues like depression and anxiety. But more recently, and I'll just mention one study here, which is especially important and which a lot of scientists are citing. This was published in 2022 in the American Economic Review. It's called Social Media and Mental Health by Brigiri, Levy, and Makaran. And they make a strong case that social media is one of the main causal factors in leading to mental health problems like depression and anxiety. So there isn't just a correlation between these two things, but there's actually a causal relation. And there are more and more studies coming out in this, making similar claims. And the main argument they make is that, or they speculate that one of the main reasons why social media, heavy social media use is causing so many problems from a mental health standpoint is that it leads to unfavorable social comparisons. That's the phrase that they use in the literature. And it means what? We'll talk about this in more detail later, hopefully, but the idea is that when we're on Instagram, when we're on Twitter, especially more visually oriented kind of social media apps and websites, we look at how amazing the lives of other people are, how beautiful other people are, with all their perfect airbrushed images and this and that, and then we start feeling inferior, and we start feeling like chopped liver, and it makes us feel bad. Our self-esteem takes a hit. And this is a huge problem, especially among teenage girls, but it's a more ubiquitous problem across age groups and different demographics. It's also affecting many other aspects of our lives. For students, it's affecting academic performance, the ability to concentrate, shortening our attention spans. The list goes on, and we'll talk about that later as well. But if you're expecting me to tell you that the solution is to stop using social media, that's not what I'm going to say. And I don't think it's realistic for most of us to go cold turkey. It's just part of life now, more or less. What I want to discuss with you today is how Vedanta can, first of all, diagnose what the dangers are in heavy social media use, and even more importantly, the positive side, which is how can Vedanta help us to use social media more mindfully and more healthily, so that it can be part of a balanced and fulfilling life. So I want to begin with the obvious, which is that social media is not an unmitigated evil. There are so many benefits. That's why we use social media so much, because we get something from it, right? It helps us connect and reconnect with people all over the world. One perk, because I lived in India for a long time, so I have a lot of monk friends over there. To keep contact, you can make free international calls using WhatsApp, right? I remember in the 80s when I was growing up that you had to spend like $1 or $2 a minute to call India. It was like crazy. So it's free, right? These are benefits. I'm an academic as well, and academia.edu is one of the websites I use, which is arguably a kind of social media website. But I post my publications and my latest work there, and that's how I network with academics, especially when I was in India where I couldn't meet them in person. So there are a lot of benefits, plenty of other things. You're apprised about upcoming events, discussions of important social issues and otherwise, fun and relaxation. Every center really should have social media sites, every one of our centers, because it's a great form of outreach, especially reaching out to the youth. But, on the other hand, social media is a kind of double-edged sword, and so there are a lot of negatives to it, and I've already talked about some of them, but if you want details, there's a 2020 documentary worth watching called The Social Dilemma. Probably some of you have seen it. But what's striking about this is that it interviews many tech insiders, people who are basically responsible, or partly responsible for creating social media and the algorithms driving social media. So examples are like Tristan Harris, who worked for Google, Justin Rosenstein, who's a co-creator of the Facebook like button, and there are many other examples. If you look at, a lot of them are parents, right? If you look at how they raise their kids, one thing is really striking. They're very strict about their kids' social media consumption. Far more strict than the average American, because they know better than anyone else, because they're the creators of these algorithms, how dangerous these things are. Some of them just don't let their kids use social media at all, or even use certain handheld devices, for instance, until a very late stage, like high school or something. And there are a lot of themes that come up about why social media is causing so many problems in society. They talk about surveillance capitalism, that social media companies profit by tracking users and predicting our behavior. Algorithmic manipulation. They manipulate us through algorithms, which they're sort of on the back end, so we don't even know that this is happening to us. We become puppets in the hands of these algorithms, which are extremely sophisticated because they have the world's best minds developing these algorithms, giving us what we want in greater and greater quantities, and every time we hit the like button, we get more and more of the same, except in a more intense form, and then we get addicted, right? And the more addicted we are, the better for them, because they make more money. And so it's a vicious cycle. It's affecting mental health. It's spreading fake news, misinformation. We're losing any vestige of free will that we once had. Now, for the rest of the talk, I want to frame the talk by bringing into the discussion a book by Candace Kelsey. It was a book published a while ago, about 2 decades ago, called Generation MySpace. A lot of the younger people in the audience might be wondering, what the heck is MySpace? That was an older social media. It's like a social media 1.0 website that was extremely popular for some time at that time, in like the 2000s. And then it just went off the map. But her insights, I think, a number of her insights are still valid now, probably more valid than ever. And you can just apply what she's saying about MySpace to the latest social media websites like Instagram and X and whatever. One of the things she says, one of the main theses in her book, is that social media is drilling into us 3 main values, each of which is leading to unhappiness and lack of fulfillment in our lives. What are these 3 values? This is the way she puts them, and then I'm going to argue for slight modifications to each of these formulations. 1, I must be entertained all the time. My life needs to be full of pleasure. I need to be having pleasure at all times. 2, this is funny. If you've got it, flaunt it. You get it? If you've got it, flaunt it. It means if you have a beautiful physical body, if you're very attractive, put it on full display on social media websites, and then you'll realize that the less clothes you wear, the more beautiful you look, the more attractive you are, the more likes you're going to get, the more retweets you're going to get, and the more validation you're going to get. 3rd value, success means being a consumer. Success, fulfillment, happiness are defined in terms of material possessions, how much you make, what you own, what luxuries you can afford. Each of these worldly values is dissected in detail by Vedanta. And I would also suggest from a Vedantic standpoint that we can kind of slightly modify these values suggested by Kelsey. First of all, her first value, remember, is I must be entertained all the time. I think that actually entertainment is one form of instant gratification. So that I think that the more accurate formulation, the more general one would be, I must be gratified all the time. I must be experiencing pleasure as much as possible. That's the first value that social media drills into us. And drilling into us doesn't mean that it's like explicitly telling us that. It might, but more often than not, it's about implicit values that it's indoctrinating us into, which makes it more pernicious because it's less easy to catch, right? I mean, how many of you have thought about these values in this explicit way? And that's why I think it's useful to bring these out. The second value, if you've got it, flaunt it. What does Vedanta say? What would be the Vedantic way of putting this? The value taught is you are the physical body. We are the physical body. Therefore, our self-worth, our identity, how we see ourselves is completely based on how beautiful the body is and how healthy the body is and how other people perceive our body. Third value, success means being a consumer. That's the way that Kelsey puts it. And Vedanta will fully agree that this is one of the most pernicious worldly values, but it'll give a deeper explanation. The explanation is the problem is that our self-worth should not be bound up with our material possessions, how much we own, how much we make, right? And so Vedanta will counter these 3 worldly values that social media is drilling into us with what I would call 3 spiritual counter values. These are the values that we need to cultivate as spiritual aspirants, as Vedantins. Number 1, try not to live your life centered around instant gratification. That doesn't mean don't have that ice cream today or whatever, especially on Mother's Day. You should be treating your mothers to all sorts of nice things. No, not that. But your life shouldn't be centered around instant gratification. That shouldn't be the be-all, end-all, and it shouldn't be the highest aim in life. Okay. And what you're going to find, what we all find, I think, in the course of just living life, is that the things most worth striving for, the deepest sources of our happiness and fulfillment, are not forms of instant gratification. They're the things that we had to work toward. They're the things that maybe weren't very pleasant in the beginning, but they become the deepest and richest sources of fulfillment later in our lives as we work on ourselves. The second counter value to, she says, if you've got it, flaunt it, right? What's the counter value that Vedanta tells us? the less body conscious we are, the less identified we are with our physical bodies, the happier we'll be. Because the root, at the very root of all of our suffering and unhappiness and misery, is our mistaken identification with the psychophysical complex, with our physical bodies and with our minds. That doesn't mean, Vedanta doesn't tell us to hate our bodies, to be ashamed of our bodies. No. Think of our bodies and minds in the right way, in the right context. Most of you came here by car, right? You don't say that I am my car. That people will think you're crazy. My car is a vehicle I use to get around. I use it to serve my purposes. Exactly like that. Our physical bodies and our minds are vehicles that we use to serve the purposes of our deeper soul. Our true identity is spiritual. We're eternal, perfectly divine, perfectly free, perfectly pure souls, atmans, using the body and using the mind as its vehicles of expression and manifestation to serve others and to make spiritual progress. And third value, she said success means being a consumer. What does Vedanta say? True success, true fulfillment is not measured in terms of how much money we make, what we own, how many luxuries we have, how many vacations we go on, but in terms of how unselfish we are, how pure we are, how content we are, how much spiritual progress have we made in our life, and how much progress have we made in realizing our true spiritual identity as atmans rather than as body or as even the mind. So now, let's analyze in a bit more detail each of these three worldly values that social media is drilling into us so that we can be mindful in the way that we use social media. And then we'll go into detail about how to cultivate these counter values, these spiritual values, and to lead a more fulfilling life. So the first one, I must be gratified all the time. This first worldly value. This is, I don't think I need to make a case for this, it's just kind of obvious. But notice what's happening, especially things like YouTube, right? When YouTube first came, it was about long-form videos, 1 hour, 2 hours. Now what's happening? It's come up with YouTube Shorts, right? And the shorter the video, the more likely it is that you're going to get more views, right? Because people's attention spans have shrunk to that of mice. They don't even want to. They can't sit through an entire talk anymore, an entire discussion, anything deep, anything with nuance. No, the more sensationalistic, the shorter, the better, and the more likely it is it's going to go viral, right? So there's a kind of arms race to shorten videos and to make them as easy for consumption as possible, right? As easy, as quick as possible. But also algorithms, as I mentioned, this is a huge part of the problem. Every time we watch a video or hit a like button or retweet something, what happens? It triggers this algorithm, and the algorithm is going to spit back to us a lot more of the same. And often it becomes more and more sensationalized, more and more polarized, until we're stuck in this kind of echo chamber, and we're in our own world. We can all be sitting here, but when we're looking at our phones, we're in our own world. Each of us is in our own world, of our own making, literally, because the algorithm is just giving us exactly what we want. We're not challenged anymore. We're not open to a diversity of viewpoints. This is becoming a massive problem, not just in politics, but just in general, intellectually as well. Academic culture is becoming more of a kind of echo chamber, even at the elite universities. In The Social Dilemma, Tristan Harris talks about one of the biggest dangers of social media. He says, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. If you're not paying for the product, you are the product. We have become commodified. We are the commodities, without knowing it most of the time, right? People who work in the industry know that, but most people don't know that. We're the commodity that's being bought and sold. Our data, our personal preferences, our psychological profile. I bet many of you, I've had this weird experience where I'm like talking at the dining table at breakfast with the other monks about something like, oh man, I'd love to have tiramisu. Whoops, and then like 5 minutes later on my phone, there's an advertisement for tiramisu. It's super creepy. Our phones might be spying on us, Lord knows. And again, Vedanta. It says exactly the same thing, and it said it thousands of years ago. This is from a great Vedantic scripture called Vairagya Shatakam. 100 verses on detachment. There's just a line which says, Bhoga na bhukta vayameva bhukta, which means we think that we are consuming things, that we are enjoying things, right? We're enjoying X or whatever, Instagram. They are consuming us. That's the truth of the matter. And we're the commodities. We think we're the subject consuming the objects. They're actually the subjects. The algorithms are more powerful than we are. We're puppets in the hands of the algorithms, and they're using us and commodifying us. It's very disturbing, actually. Another aspect of this, as I mentioned earlier, is that social media is playing a major role in shrinking our attention spans. My favorite poet, Western poet, I should say, is T.S. Eliot. And I wrote my undergraduate thesis on his poetry, and one of my favorite poems is 4 Quartets, which is 4 poems. And the first of those 4 quartets is called Burnt Norton. Published written in 1935. And he lived in England at the time. So he's sketching this scene, just imagine, 1935, London subway. You're in a subway car full of commuters, passengers. No smartphones, no laptops, but what do they have? Newspapers. So every person has their nose buried in a newspaper. They're not looking at each other, they're just buried in the newspaper. So he walks in and he just sees these people with their faces buried in their newspapers. That's the scene that he's sketching here. And so let me read to you a few lines from this great poem, one of my favorites. He says, and it's not a coincidence that he studied Sanskrit at Harvard and studied Vedanta in the Gita. Neither plenitude nor vacancy, only a flicker over the strained, time-ridden faces, distracted from distraction by distraction, filled with fancies and empty of meaning, tumid apathy with no concentration, men and bits of paper, the newspapers, whirled by the cold wind that blows before and after time, wind in and out of unwholesome lungs, time before and time after, eructation of unhealthy souls into the faded air, the torpid driven on the wind that sweeps the gloomy hills of London, Hampstead and Clerkenwell, Camden and Putney, Highgate, Primrose and Ludgate. These are all subway stops. Not here, the darkness in this twittering world. 1935, almost a century ago, and he's using Twitter here. He anticipated Twitter. Not here, the darkness in this twittering world. Darkness is not a bad thing here. Giving time to ourselves, some breathing space to the soul, some downtime, instead of just constantly seeking and craving stimuli of different sorts. That's what he means by darkness here, right? Abstaining from stimulations is the great austerity now in this age, for all of us. So there are many, many studies on how social media is causing all sorts of problems with our attention span, concentration. It's feeding into things like ADHD, attention deficit disorders, and then also other mental health issues, partly as a result. And teenagers kind of often they pride themselves on saying that we're great at multitasking, so we can be using social media on our phones and at the same time be doing our math homework. It doesn't work that way. And their work is suffering and their performance is suffering as a result. With all these notifications, these social media websites, they thrive on they just constantly want you to be engaged, right? So how do they do that? Pings, notifications, constantly, these different right? So one of the best things you can do is just turn off notifications. That doesn't mean you stop using social media, but just turn off the notifications. Dopamine Nation is a book published in 2021 by a Stanford psychotherapist named Anna Lemke. I talked about it in a previous lecture, but she says the smartphone is the modern day hypodermic needle, delivering digital dopamine 24/7 for a wired generation. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter. It's a chemical that makes us feel good. And these different forms of instant gratification, what they do is they give us a kind of dopamine rush, a dopamine buzz, which makes us feel good. And then we crave it. And what happens? We get sucked into a vicious cycle of addiction. She says the pull of dopamine is so strong that studies have shown that tweeting is harder for people to resist than cigarettes and alcohol. And so there are these two fundamentally different kinds of addiction. But they have the same structure. So they're substance addictions to cigarettes, alcohol, drugs, and so on. And then there are behavioral addictions, addictions to certain kinds of behavior, patterns of behavior, like heavy social media use, for instance. Right? Use of pornography is another massive problem these days. So behavioral addictions are soaring now with the advent of social media, internet, AI, and it's become a huge problem. And a lot of people, they don't talk about it because it kind of is more under the radar than substance addictions, right? Which is well known and which has been a problem for many centuries. So what's the neuroscience behind it? The idea is that any form of instant gratification will lead to a sudden spike in dopamine levels. It'll make us feel good momentarily, but then ultimately our dopamine levels will come crashing down and it'll go lower than the baseline rate. And then we need more of that behavior or that substance to get the same kind of dopamine rush or high that we were getting before. Which means what? We need more of that substance. We need to consume social media for more time, for more minutes or hours in order to get that same dopamine buzz that we were getting before. And it becomes a vicious cycle. So how do we break out of it? Well, Vedanta tells us, this is another great Vedantic scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Most of you are familiar with it. Gita in chapter 18 distinguishes different kinds of happiness. And it distinguishes the three kinds of happiness in terms of the three gunas, the three energies, which I've talked about a lot here, so I'm not going to go in detail here. So the Rajasika kind of happiness, this is a happiness based on Rajas. And Rajas is the energy that manifests as things like being full of desires, ambitions, ego, arrogance, all these kinds of things, right? Being self-centered. Rajasika happiness is defined as follows. Vishayendriya sanyogad yattat agrem ritopamam pariname vishameva tatsukham radasam swadam, which means Rajasika happiness, so this applies to all forms of instant gratification. It's happiness that derives from the contact of sense organs, like the eyes and ears, with sense objects. In the beginning, these different forms of instant gratification are like nectar. In the end, they become like poison. In the end, they become like poison. Right? And we want it because of that instant high, the dopamine high. Without realizing that, or even when we do sometimes, we know, after we've had enough hangovers or whatever, we know that it's not going to last, right? But it's so hard for us to resist doing it again, right? We know that it's poison in the end, but still, we get trapped in that loop, that cycle. So ultimately, there's really usually only a spiritual solution to breaking out of the cycle of addiction. But why exactly are sense pleasures, why are all forms of instant gratification like poison in the end? It's a good question. Vedanta gives a very deep answer. Another scripture, Bhagavata Purana. There's a great verse which explains the logic of all instant gratification. Na jatu kamaha kamanam upavogena shamyati havisha krishnavatmeva bhuya eva vivartate, which means desire is never satisfied through enjoyment. We think that if there's a desire in our minds, right? I want something. Well, the way to get rid of that desire is to fulfill it. Get the object of desire, and then I'll be happy. This is the fantasy that most of us labor under. But what happens the moment you struggle hard to get that object of desire, and then you get it? Not everybody is lucky enough to get it, but let's say you get it. You get it, super happy for a short period of time, and then what happens? Unfavorable social comparison again, as these studies talk about. The moment, let's say my desire is to make $1 million. I spend 20, 30 hard years working, slaving away 80 hours a week until I get that $1 million. I got it. I get the Mercedes I want and this and that. And then I turn to now I've got a new peer group. I'm running with the millionaires and multimillionaires. So now I'm hanging out with friends who make hundreds of $1 million more than I do. So now just being a millionaire is not enough. Now I need to spend my time becoming a multimillionaire and buying several yachts to compete with my new peer group. And it never ends. There's no end to this. There's always going to be somebody wealthier than you. There's always going to be someone prettier than you. So what's the Vedantic antidote, the Vedantic solution to this obsession with instant gratification? Well, let's try to populate our lives with Satvika forms of fulfillment and happiness. Satvika, that's the best of the three gunas, the more spiritual of the three gunas. So how does the Gita define Satvika happiness? It defines it as follows. Yattad agre vishamiva pariname mritopamam tatsukham satvikam proktam atma buddhi prasadajam. Sattvika forms of joy, sattvika forms of fulfillment have the following structure. It's exactly the opposite of Rajasika happiness. It feels like poison in the beginning. You don't like it. It doesn't feel good most of the time. But ultimately, it becomes like the greatest nectar. We gradually cultivate a taste for it. And the deepest reason why we should try to cultivate sattvika forms of fulfillment comes in that last phrase, Atma Buddhi Prasadajam. There's a qualitative difference between Rajasika forms of happiness and Sattvika forms of happiness. Rajasika forms of happiness gratify either the physical body or the mind or both at the same time. And Sattvika forms of happiness gratify the soul within us, the Atman within us. So every time we replace a Rajasika form of happiness, an instant gratification, every time, let's say that we consume social media for 2 hours a day. Let's say we cut our social media use by a half hour and spend that half hour in listening to nice spiritual music, for instance, or watching a good spiritual discourse on YouTube. What happened? That's even arguably social media, but it's a kind of sattvic use of social media. What happens? For that time, what we're doing is gratifying the deeper soul within us, and it's helping to gradually erode our mistaken identification with the body-mind complex. And the more we're able to identify with our true spiritual nature, the happier we'll be. That's in one line, that's the ultimate Vedantic solution, or science of happiness. The more we identify ourselves with our true spiritual nature, the happier and more fulfilled we will be. What are other examples of sattvika activities that we can engage in? Any kind of spiritual practice, take your pick. Vedanta is very broad, and so if you like mindfulness, do that. Loving kindness meditation, do that. Service, social service is a wonderful form of spiritual practice. Any kind of devotional activities, japa, prayer, worship, great. So take your pick. Exercise, less well known as a spiritual practice, but I think that it should be better known. But everything depends on your attitude. But you can spiritualize exercise as well. You can purify and spiritualize the attitude with which you engage in physical exercise. So instead of thinking about yourself as a body and trying to make your body more attractive and beautiful so that other people will want you more, that would be a more worldly kind of motivation. The main motivation should be to keep a healthy body, because the body is the temple of the divine. And without a healthy body, you can't engage in spiritual practices. Right? And if you do that, what study after study is finding is that exercise, regular physical exercise, is more effective in alleviating mental health problems like depression and anxiety than even prescription antidepressants and other medications. In some cases, of course, medication may be necessary, but what a number of psychiatrists are finding and what they're recommending, they're saying that exercise, regular exercise, should be a legitimate first-line treatment for mental health issues and not just an added extra, as it's often seen in medicine. So the tides are changing on this issue. And before therapists and psychiatrists prescribe medicines, they're going to first often recommend things like regular physical exercise. They'll look at the lifestyle of the person who's suffering from this mental health issue and recommend regular physical exercise if that's not a part of their lifestyle. So that's also sattvic, just depending on your attitude. And again, how do you do the exercise? So you can easily make it spiritual. How do you do it? If you're jogging, repeat the mantra internally, right? You can even synchronize it with your pace, with the breath. You can do the same thing. Swimming is great. I love swimming, and because it's a kind of like sensory deprivation chamber, because you're underwater, literally. And so the whole world is shut out, and it's just you and God. It's amazing. You just bliss out, do your swimming. All right, so that's all with regard to the first value. I've got a number of other values to cover, and I don't have much time. Second value, if you've got it, flaunt it. That's the way that Candace Kelsey puts it, but what's the idea? Social media is strengthening our identification with our physical bodies, and that's a major problem these days. Airbrushing they're all like apps devoted to just making yourself look as perfect as possible, and there's this whole new phenomenon called body dysmorphia. What's happening now, especially in a place like LA, where we live, what's happening is people will take these apps, airbrush, and use all sorts of filters to make themselves look as attractive as possible. Print it out like a nice, fancy, glossy color copy or whatever, take it to the plastic surgeon and ask them to modify their faces and bodies in a way that looks like that airbrush photo of themselves. So body dysmorphia, it takes many forms in terms of different social media sites, but like we're starting to have distorted images of ourselves, and we're holding ourselves to impossible standards of beauty. Post-COVID, a lot of us have now started using like Zoom and other kinds of video chatting things. And it's kind of disconcerting because you always see yourself right while you're talking to the person on the other side. And some people get just obsessed with looking at themselves and, wait, I didn't know I looked like that. Oh my goodness, my nose looks like that. And they start obsessing. And they can't get out of their heads. And the more they're on Zoom, the more they start thinking about how ugly they are. And it's this crazy they get into this kind of psychological arms race where they try to look more and more beautiful, holding themselves to these impossible standards. And it's leading to a lot of mental health issues. So Vedanta says, you need to cut at the root of the problem. The body is our vehicle. We are not our bodies. That's the fundamental insight that Vedanta gives us. It reminds me of a very moving incident in the life of Swami Vivekananda, who founded our monastic order. Probably most of you know that. He's walking with a group of Westerners in Cairo. And they ended up by accident in a kind of seedy part of the town. And there were these scantily clad prostitutes on the other side of the street heckling. They started heckling him because he's wearing religious garb, and they started heckling him. Maybe even they were thinking that he's playing hard to get, let's try to lure him over. Who knows? The moment he notices, he looks over at them, comes close to them, and starts weeping. And he says, poor children, poor creatures, they have put their divinity in their beauty, in their physical beauty. Look at them now. And then the story goes. This is written by one of the people who accompanied him, a famous opera singer, Madame Emma Calvé. She says, Swami Vivekananda began to weep, as Jesus might have done before the woman taken in adultery. The women were silenced and abashed. One of them leaned forward and kissed the hem of his robe, murmuring brokenly in Spanish, Hombre de Dios. Hombre de Dios. I don't know Spanish, sorry. Forgive me for the bad pronunciation. Man of God, man of God. The other, with a sudden gesture of modesty and fear, threw her arm in front of her face, as though she would screen her shrinking soul from those pure eyes. So this has always been a problem, but it's become intensified. It's become exacerbated with modern technologies, internet, and especially social media. Vedanta tells us we are all equally beautiful as souls, right? We really need to start focusing on ourselves as souls and recognize the inner beauty of everybody instead of focusing so much and obsessing so much about our physical beauty. So the more we identify with the body and spend our time, our attention, our money on trying to beautify our body, the unhappier we'll be, because the body's not going to last and it won't be pretty forever. The body's our vehicle, so don't hate it. Try to keep it healthy and use it as a vehicle of the expression of our innate beauty, our innate divinity. Third value, remember, success means being a consumer. What does Vedanta say about this? That same scripture that I mentioned earlier, 100 verses on detachment, Vairagya Shatakam. There's a great verse. Satu bhavati daridro yasya trishna vishala manasi cha paritushte kortavan ko daridraha. This verse very succinctly gives the best definitions of true wealth and true poverty I've ever come across. That person is poor whose desires are great. Satu bhavati daridro yasya trishna vishala. That person, true poverty is to have a lot of desires. And what is true wealth? Manasi cha paritushte kortavan ko daridraha. The truly wealthy person is the one who is content in mind. Content with what he or she has. And doesn't need anything more. So, just think about it concretely. If I have $1 million, but I want $10 million, I will be much less happy than the person who makes $75,000 but is content with the $75,000 a year. So it's not success, fulfillment, happiness is not defined in terms of how much we make, how much we consume, what we own or don't own, but in terms of contentment, inner contentment and peace. And then there are a bunch of other reasons that study after study is showing as to why social media is making us unhappier and unhappier. One of them is this phenomenon called FOMO, fear of missing out. We look at all the fun that our friends are having right now in real time. We're like, okay, so now I want to do the same thing, or I want to put on an even bigger party and post my pictures so that they're jealous of me. And again, this becomes another kind of arms race. But even more deeply and insidiously, social media is turning us all into narcissists. In the DSM, there's a narcissistic personality disorder, there are grandiose narcissists, there are covert narcissists. That's not what we're talking about. Ordinary people now, it may not be like diagnosable as a psychiatric condition, but still, just kind of low-key narcissism is just the norm now with heavy social media users. What do I mean by that? Time magazine, they have this Person of the Year. It used to be a sexist Man of the Year, then it became Person of the Year. And in 2006, Person of the Year, you. And the idea here is, we are the stars of the show now. Andy Warhol, long back, he was this great postmodern artist. He said, in the future, we will all be famous for 15 minutes. And that's exactly true now. If you just, one viral blog post, one viral video or reel or this or that, and then that's it. And then you're on all the news channels and this and that, and you're riding high, and then what happens inevitably? You come crashing down again. It never lasts. It never lasts. And there are all sorts of tragic cases of social media influencers who become extremely popular and famous overnight. Only, within a couple years or months later, people forget all about them, and then they become terribly depressed. Some even commit suicide. And in this arms race to become famous, what do people do? They post more and more salacious pictures of themselves. They do more and more risky things to get those likes and in the hopes that their thing will go viral. They start taking selfies of themselves hanging over a cliff. Some people have died as a result of doing these kinds of crazy things. And one of the more disturbing things is that the creators of social media knew this from the beginning and are really feeding into it. I'll just give you one example. The YouTube co-founder, Chad Hurley. There's not a single person in the room who doesn't use YouTube here, I'm sure, but this is what the co-founder of YouTube, Chad Hurley, says. Everyone in the back of his mind wants to be a star. It's disturbing if you think about it. That's why Ramakrishna, he says, when you pray to God, first thing you should pray for is, I don't want any kinds of instant gratification, any kinds of sense pleasures, things that gratify the body. And then he says, and I don't want name and fame. I don't care for these things. Because it's so dangerous. And even after you've conquered lust and greed, Mahamaya can catch you by the throat in the form of name and fame. That's why Swami Vivekananda, he actually said, he says, 99% of sadhus, meaning monks, even after renouncing lust and wealth, get bound at the last by the desire for name and fame. Fame, that last infirmity of noble mind. Haven't you read? He's quoting John Milton's poem Lycidas. It's very dangerous. So now, I want to end the talk on a positive note with practical tips and solutions. How do we navigate this unprecedented age of instant gratification? As I said, I'm not proposing any kind of cold turkey solution like just stop using social media. No, it's not realistic, and I don't think ultimately it's helpful. It'll end up being a kind of repression or suppression, and that's going to backfire in the end. I do think sometimes it's worth unplugging. That's great. And you can do these little meditation retreats, silent retreats for 3 days, 10 days, whatever. And the first thing they tell you to do usually, if it's Goenka or whatever, it's like, give me your phones, your devices. And people are, they're relieved when they're forced to give up these devices, right? But they don't want to give it up on their own. But when they actually choose to go to these retreats, the equivalent for us monks is we go to a 2-year training center when we're novitiates in Belumut in India. And right when you enter training center, you hand over your smartphones and your laptops, and you don't get them for 2 years. And at first, because they're used to it, because in their centers, they have to do work. I need my smartphone all the time for different reasons. I've got WhatsApp groups for my hiking group and this and that. I talked about my hiking group here earlier, right? But then you give it up, and then at first it's a little hard. It's that poison. And then you're like, oh, man, it's like a new life, you know? Anyway, so yeah, once in a while going cold turkey is good, but I don't think it's realistic as a long-term solution. But here's what Vedanta suggests. Remember again, what are the 3 Vedantic spiritual counter values to the 3 values that we've been talking about, the worldly values? Number 1, don't live your life centered around instant gratification. Okay? So ground your life in spiritual values. Try to populate your life with more and more forms of Satvika happiness and Satvika forms of fulfillment. Okay, and that applies to the kind of music you listen to, the kind of movies you watch. Try to spiritualize your consumption. What kind of YouTube videos do you watch? Are they, spiritual discourses, or are they other kinds of things? Right. So ask yourself that and be honest. Number 2, try to reduce your identification with the physical body and try to think more and more of your body as a vehicle. Right? As something you use to express your innate divinity and innate beauty. And the third key spiritual value that's really important to keep in mind as you navigate and use social media, true happiness, true fulfillment does not come from making a lot of money or in terms of how much stuff you own, but in terms of reducing our wants, being content with what we already have. And now, keeping those 3 spiritual values in the background, we can now arrive at, I'll just give a few sort of concrete tips in terms of how we can better use social media in a balanced life. So number 1, be more mindful and honest in your use of social media. Use it, fine. But number 1, just be honest about how many hours a day do you spend on social media? Okay, that's the first question to ask. Number 2, if your answer, once you're honest with yourself, is kind of high or alarmingly high, you need to ask yourself why. Why is it that I spend so much of my day using social media? And what kind of social media am I using? And just be honest with yourself. What do I get out of it? And if it's very heavy social media use, I can guarantee you that it's a proxy for it's a kind of temporary filling of this void in your heart. There's something missing in your life that you're using social media to cope with as a kind of temporary coping mechanism, but it's just making the void grow. You're ignoring that void, and it's growing bigger and bigger as a result. So that's the first thing, is just be more mindful in your use of social media. Why you're using it, how often you're using it. Second, Anna Lemke, Anna Lemke, that woman who wrote the book Dopamine Nation at Stanford. She talks about what she calls self-binding strategies, and this is a fancy term, but Vedanta calls it tapasya, means austerity. And this is not the kind of austerity that these monks in India who are famous for, like standing on one leg for 50 years and this and that. No, each one of us, non-monks, monks, household, it doesn't matter, 5-year-olds or whatever, each of us should practice this kind of self-binding strategy, this kind of austerity. It's what she calls dopamine fasting. We need to abstain from dopamine highs sometimes. We need to take a break from dopamine once in a while just to be balanced and sane these days in this age of instant gratification. So what does that look like concretely with respect to social media use? Well, there are different ways of abstaining from social media without going cold turkey. Simple things, turning off notifications. That's something I mentioned earlier. You're still using them, but you're turning off the notifications, so it's not as much of a constant presence with this ping, pong, pong. And then another thing you can do, restrict your social media use to your larger devices, like your iPads or your laptops. Because what happens? That means you're not using social media on your smartphones anymore, which is what you carry with you, for most of the day. And even when you're going to sleep, it's by your bedside. Some people are so addicted that they can't even fall asleep because they're just curious about, oh man, what's my friend doing at that party? And this and that. And then there's like bright glare, and there's also these lighting things because it messes with our circadian rhythms, right? Because you have to slowly kind of like seduce yourself into sleep by having a dark atmosphere. And so this phone is constantly disrupting even those kinds of things. So they're huge. So if you can just exercise some self-restraint in some way, and for young kids, that's very difficult. It's hard to expect that from them on their own. So parents here really need to play a role in regulating their children's social media use. And one of these tips would be, don't use social media on smartphones, or restrict social media use to certain times of day. You can ban social media use or smartphone use at the dinner table, for goodness sakes. There's like, even now, in-person interaction has become a scarcity now. But the more disturbing thing is, even when people get together, eating and whatever, everybody's just hooked to their smartphone. It's just really sad. Last but not least, and I want to end on this note, serve others. This is one of the most powerful antidotes to this current age of instant gratification, because at the root of the lure, the temptation of social media, why we're so addicted to it, why it pulls us in, draws us in so much, is this narcissism epidemic, this narcissism problem. Because we're at the center of our world. We've all become kind of navel gazers, solipsists. And the best antidote is to serve others, is to think about other people more than we think about ourselves. And that applies to everybody. You can be a kid, you can be an adult, but serve, go out and serve. By serving others, we become less self-absorbed, less egocentric, and automatically we become happier. You're going to find. If you just replace 1 hour of social media use, go out to a soup kitchen, help serve those in need, you're going to feel better about yourself. You'll be happier. That's what Swami Vidananda called practical Vedanta. Make Vedanta practical in your day-to-day life by serving others in a spirit of worship. What's the point of just going to a church or a temple and praying to God there? Try to see God in every living being. And I want to end with the final stanza of my favorite poem of Swami Vivekananda's. It was originally written in Bengali. It's called Shakarproti. So I'll read the last four lines in Bengali first, and then I'll just give my own translation, and I'll end it there. Brahma hote kit paramanu, সর্বভূতে সেই প্রেমময়, মন প্রাণ শরীর অর্পণ কর সখে এ সবার পায়, বহুরূপে সম্মুখে তোমার, ছাড়ি কোথা খুঁজিছ ঈশ্বর, জীবে প্রেম করে যেই জন, সেই জন সেবেছে ঈশ্বর. From Brahman down to the worm and atom, in all things, the same God of love dwells. Friend, offer mind, life, and body at their feet. These are God's various forms right in front of you. Rejecting them, ignoring them, where are you looking for God? One who loves all beings truly serves God. Thank you.